Right now, many signs are pointing toward a possible recession in the United States. Major financial institutions, like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, have raised the chances of a recession this year. One of the key contributing factors? Tariffs, new import taxes introduced by the U.S. government. If the U.S. really does fall into a recession, countries that heavily depend on trade with America will feel the shockwaves. Here are the top 10 countries that could be hit the hardest. 1. Mexico. You might think Mexico would be safe, but the truth is, the Mexican and U.S. economies are deeply connected. Each year, billions of dollars flow between the two countries through trade. In 2013, over 80% of Mexico's exports went to the U.S., including cars, electronics, and agricultural products. If U.S. consumers start cutting back due to a crisis, demand for Mexican goods will drop fast. That could push Mexico into a serious downturn, with rising unemployment and deepening poverty. On top of that, many families in Mexico depend on money sent home from relatives working in the U.S., called remittances. If income levels fall in America, those remittances could dry up, leaving millions in Mexico struggling to get by. 2. Canada. Canada may be a wealthy, stable country with strong social systems, but it's still highly dependent on the U.S. Over 70% of Canadian exports go to the U.S., making it Canada's largest and most vital trade partner. If the U.S. economy slows down, Canada's economy could stumble too. Some may argue that Canada has oil and gas to fall back on, but oil prices are tied to U.S. demand. If that demand drops, prices crash, and Canada's energy industry suffers badly. It's not just oil. Recession could trigger job losses, rising unemployment, and a cooling housing market. Even with strong social safety nets, prolonged economic pressure could push Canada toward a financial crisis. So the big question is, can Canada survive without leaning on the U.S. economy? 3. South Korea. South Korea is a global tech powerhouse, home to giants like Samsung and Hyundai. These companies are key to the nation's exports, and a major chunk of those exports go to the U.S. In 2003, over 14% of South Korea's GDP came from exports to the U.S., particularly semiconductors, electronics, and cars. If a U.S. recession hits, demand for these products will plummet. American tech firms, the biggest buyers of Korean chips, will cut budgets. That means lower production for companies like Samsung and SK Hynix. This could ripple across South Korea's economy, layoffs, wage stagnation, and reduced consumer spending. While South Korea has a strong and organized economy, its heavy reliance on the U.S. makes it vulnerable to external shocks. 4. Brazil. Brazil is the largest economy in South America, but still vulnerable to a U.S. downturn. Over 20% of Brazil's exports in 2003 went to the U.S., including soybeans, iron ore, and oil. If U.S. demand weakens, Brazil's agricultural and mining sectors could suffer massive losses. Unemployment is already high in Brazil. Falling exports could worsen poverty and inequality. Add rising national debt, and Brazil becomes highly exposed to global economic shifts. A U.S. recession could crash global commodity prices, hitting Brazil's oil income, increasing inflation, and stirring social unrest. 5. India. India is the world's outsourcing capital, and much of that business comes from the U.S. Nearly 60% of revenue in India's IT and service sectors comes from American clients. Cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad have boomed thanks to U.S. tech contracts. But if a recession strikes, U.S. firms will slash budgets, and Indian outsourcing will take a big hit. Canceled projects, layoffs, and shrinking income will follow. India also relies heavily on remittances from its workers abroad. In 2012-13, India received over $120 billion in remittances, 28% of which came from the U.S. If migrant workers in the U.S. earn less, families back home in India will suffer. Combined, this could lead to a double crisis: rising unemployment and soaring poverty. 6. Turkey. Turkey may seem distant from the U.S., but its economy is deeply tied to American trade and investment. Already battling inflation, a weak lira, and fragile growth, Turkey could spiral if U.S. demand drops. Textiles, machinery, and industrial exports to the U.S. would fall sharply. Worse, foreign investment, especially from the U.S., could flee. That would devalue the lira further and trigger hyperinflation. Tourism and trade, two other key sectors, would also suffer. With falling exports, fleeing capital, and rising unemployment, Turkey could face economic chaos and even political unrest. 7. Argentina. Argentina has long been vulnerable to external shocks, especially from the U.S. With inflation over 100%, a crashing peso, and sky-high debt, Argentina is already walking a tightrope. The country relies heavily on exports: soybeans, oil, wheat, with the U.S. as a key buyer. If demand vanishes, Argentina's income collapses. Unemployment and poverty will surge. Plus, if global banks tighten credit, Argentina could lose access to international financing, risking default, hyperinflation, and nationwide protests. 8. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's economy is almost entirely driven by oil, and the U.S. is one of its top buyers. If U.S. oil demand falls, Saudi income dries up. Worse, if global oil prices crash, the kingdom's financial system could be shaken. Yes, they have large cash reserves. But oil is not just income. It fuels the entire economy. Without steady oil revenue, Saudi Arabia could face a full-blown fiscal crisis. 9. Nigeria. Nigeria depends almost entirely on oil exports. Over 90% of its export revenue comes from oil, and a big chunk goes to the U.S. If a U.S. recession lowers demand, Nigeria could lose its main income stream. That would cripple public services, trigger mass unemployment, and worsen political instability. Millions in Nigeria also rely on remittances from abroad. If those stop, poverty could deepen dramatically. The country already faces high unemployment, inflation, and insecurity. A U.S. recession could tip it into full economic collapse. 10. China. China has enjoyed explosive growth for decades, but it relies heavily on exports to the U.S. Each year, China ships over $450 billion worth of goods to America. If that flow is disrupted, China's manufacturing engine stalls. Factories close. Jobs vanish. Growth slows. China also depends on U.S. investment. If that dries up, its financial system could be shaken. And don't forget, China has massive debt, from corporations to local governments. A global slowdown could turn manageable debt into a ticking time bomb. If global demand falls, not only will U.S. sales vanish, other countries will also stop buying. This creates a global domino effect, and even China may not be able to escape it. If the U.S. enters a recession, the consequences won't stay within its borders. These 10 countries, and many more, could face serious economic turbulence.